Late summer 1071. A high plain south of Lake Van, in the Armenian frontier of the Eastern Roman Empire. The afternoon sun has not touched the western horizon yet, but the dust raised by 20,000 Turkmen ponies already darkens it. The Byzantine line has been wheeling and unwheeling for 6 hours under arrow fire. The right wing under the German axemen still holds. The left, under the Cappadocian and Armenian cavalry, has begun to drift. In the center, the emperor's gold on red standard moves forward, then back, then forward again, while a third of the army cannot see it for the dust, and follows on the noise of trumpets that the Turkmen kettle drums are already drowning out. Somewhere in the rolling ground behind the imperial banner, an order to turn the line about and march back to the night camp is being given. Somewhere behind that, a second-in-command is reading the order as something else entirely. 40,000 men marched east under the emperor's standard that summer. The lower estimate by the chronicler Michael Attaliates, who was on the campaign with the imperial staff and could count the bread allotments out of Theodosiopolis. Closer to 40 than to the inflated 70 you sometimes read in later Greek sources, the 100 you sometimes read in Arabic ones, the hundreds of thousands a careless modern writer will copy without questioning. 6 hours from this Friday afternoon, a third of those 40,000 will be dead or scattered. The emperor of the Romans, the imperator and autocrator, and the heir to Justinian, Constantine and Basil, will be on his knees in a stranger's tent with a foreign sultan's knee resting on the back of his neck. And an empire that had outlasted Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Avars, and a century of its own civil wars, will have lost the heart of Asia Minor in one afternoon and never gotten it back. This is the story of how one Cappadocian general, raised in the old Roman frontier discipline by a father killed in the Bulgar Wars, walked his army into a battle that ended an empire's hold on a continent, and how he was undone not by the man across the field, who would, in the event, behave with strange mercy, but by the men behind him. It is the story of a kiss, too, given 3 days after the battle by the winner to the loser, which the Greek and Arab chronicles cannot stop returning to for 2 centuries. The battle has a name, Manzikert, Malazgirt on the modern Turkish map, a small fortress town on a low rise above the plain, 6 days east of Theodosiopolis, 4 days west of the Persian frontier, and a week's ride southwest of the heart of medieval Armenia. North of it, the line of the Murat River. South of it, the great inland sea of Lake Van, a body of water so saline that no fish lived in its deeps, only one strange small species of carp that climbed the inflowing streams to spawn. East of the town, the rolling country thinned into open steppe, the country the Turkmen called Yelak, summer pasture. The Romans took Manzikert without a fight on the 23rd of August. They sat in the town for 3 days. They sent a column south, under the Norman captain Roussel de Bailleul and the Byzantine general Tarquiniotes, to seize the larger town of Kilat on the southern lakeshore. And then, on the 26th, a Friday by every chronicle that names the day, the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes met the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan in open battle outside the citadel. Michael Attaliates was there, a military judge attached to the campaign, hostile to the emperor for personal reasons that come clear later, but with the legal mind that records names, ranks, marches, and tents. He describes the army split, the late march, the order of battle, the dust. Attaliates also names no one in particular who warned Romanos against dividing his army on the morning of the battle. The warnings exist in his chronicle. The names of the men who gave them do not. I read this passage 3 times before I noticed what it is not saying. The decision to split the column was the emperor's. The advisors he is said to have ignored are a polite chronicler's silence over the fact that the emperor's own judgment, on that day, did not survive contact with the ground. The Friday line was not, in any meaningful sense, a Roman army. It was the residue of a Roman army, padded with what the imperial treasury had been able to hire in the last decade. On the right wing, German axemen under their own captains, heavy infantry the empire had been buying since the death of Basil II because it had stopped producing its own. On the left, Cappadocian and Armenian cavalry on small step-cross horses, far fewer than there should have been, because the Armenian themes had been farmed for tax revenue and stripped of their soldier tenants by 2 generations of civilian administration. In the center, around the emperor, the imperial tagmata, the Varangians from the Rus and the Scandinavian world, the Pechenegs who had defected from across the Danube 2 summers earlier and could not be trusted entirely, and the household cavalry of the great Anatolian families. The Frankish contingent under Roussel de Bayeux, the same Roussel mentioned a moment ago, had marched off to kill out with Tarquiniotes the previous evening and would never rejoin the main army on time. Some sources say they deserted, others that the order itself was the desertion. All sources agree they were missing on the Friday morning when the emperor needed them. The pay chest at the rear, Italiades says with the precision of a man who had counted it, weighed half a ton of silver. In the second line, the line that decides battles on a step because the first line dies absorbing the arrow storm and the second line catches the wheel of the feigned retreat, Romanos placed Andronicos Ducas. He was the son of the Caesar John Ducas, head of the most powerful family in Constantinople. He was the nephew of the previous emperor, the same Constantine X, whom Romanos had effectively displaced by marrying his widow, the Empress Eudokia Macrombolitissa. Andronicos had been given the rear column by his emperor because the emperor did not trust him out of sight. He commanded somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 men, including the household cavalry of the Ducas faction, the second largest standing force on the Friday field. The choice was rational. Andronicos was a competent general. The court had insisted he be given a command. Keeping him in the rear column, under the emperor's eye, was the politic answer to an impossible domestic problem. When the order to wheel about came down the line in the late afternoon, to turn the army around and march back to its night camp on Manzikert Hill, Nikephoros Bryennios the Younger, writing 50 years later from the court memory of the Ducas Komnenos household into which he had married, says that Andronicos either misread the standard or chose to read it as something else. He passed word along the rear column that the emperor's banner had fallen and that the army should disperse to its camp. Whether he believed this or invented it is a question the historians Speros Vrionis and Claude Cahen have spent careers arguing about. Vrionis thinks Andronicos believed it. Cahen thinks the Ducas faction had decided weeks earlier in Constantinople that the emperor would not return from this campaign and had prepared the second-line behavior accordingly. I lean toward Cahen, and I will explain why on the third day after the battle, when the captured emperor is sitting in the Sultan's tent and a delegation arrives from his own capital. By Bryennios' count, the rear column was off the field before the center had grasped what had happened. The Turkmen wheel completed itself unopposed. The German axemen on the right, attacked from behind, broke and ran for the river. The Armenian cavalry on the left was already dispersing. The center, the emperor with his Varangians, his Pechenegs, and a few hundred household cavalry, fought to its last circle, dismounted in the dust, and was overrun. The Arab historian Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, working a century later from sources now lost, preserved the line that the Sultan fought personally in the final ring. Alp Arslan was 40 years old that summer. He was lean. He was an excellent rider. He had spent the previous decade subduing nomads who had not yet decided whether to call him their Khan or their enemy. He was practiced at this kind of fighting in a way that no one in the imperial line had ever been. There is more to say about the battle and about the 3 days afterwards inside the Sultan's tent. The battle, in the end, is not the question. The question is older. Why was an emperor of the Romans, a Cappadocian 3 years on his throne, leading the largest field army Constantinople had assembled in a generation into a province whose own theme troops should have been holding the frontier without him? Why were the men in his line speaking Greek, German, Frankish, Pecheneg, and Latin? Why was the soldier class of Anatolia, the small farmers who had filled the legions of Basil II 2 generations earlier, absent from that field? Why, 3 days after the battle, did the Sultan release the captured emperor on terms his own court would refuse to honor? And why did a delegation from Constantinople, dispatched within 10 days of the news reaching the capital, ride out not to ransom the emperor, but to make sure he never came home? If this period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small political decisions that lost provinces faster than battles did, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to the plains south of Van on the morning of the 26th. To understand what happened on the rolling ground south of Lake Van that Friday, you have to understand what Byzantium had done with itself in the 46 years between the death of Basil II and the morning Romanos Diogenes rode east. You have to understand which families had won the long internal war between the civilian court at Constantinople and the military aristocracy of Anatolia. You have to understand which provinces had been farmed for revenue and which for soldiers, and which kinds of men the emperor had to hire because the empire no longer produced them. And you have to understand why a man whose own father had died on a Bulgar frontier wanted, against the advice of every party at his court, against the cooler instincts of his own household, to fight this particular battle in this particular August on a plain he had never seen. The night of the 15th of December in the year 1025, the Bucolion Palace in Constantinople. A side chamber off the imperial bedroom, smelling of beeswax candles and the resinous incense the eunuchs of the bedchamber burned to mask the smell of an old man's dying. In a low bed under a coverlet of murex purple lay the body of the Emperor Basil II, called the Bulgar Slayer by his soldiers and the Macedonian by the chroniclers. He was 67 years old. He had not married. He had not raised a son. He had ruled the empire for 49 years and added more territory to it than any emperor since Justinian. He died with a campaign already organized in his head. The fleet was being readied in the western Adriatic. The army was being mustered in the east. The target was Sicily, lost to Arab armies a century and a half earlier and still rich enough to feed Constantinople for a decade. The maps were drawn. The marching orders had been drafted. They lay on a table in the same room where Basil's body lay cooling. Within a year, the maps had been put away. The fleet stood down. The army at Antioch was sent home in small detachments to garrison towns. The Sicilian expedition would not be reattempted for another 40 years, and when it was, by another emperor in another century, it would fail. Basil II died, and the institution that had been the Eastern Roman Empire for 7 centuries took a turn from which it never recovered. His brother Constantine, 65 years old, illiterate in the business of state, ascended the throne and reigned for 3 years. He spent his evenings at racing and at the dinner table. Constantine VIII left no son either, only 3 daughters. The eldest, Zoe, was 48 when her father died. The middle daughter had taken vows in a convent at Petrion. The youngest, Theodora, was 46. Zoe was married off in haste to a senator the dying emperor settled on. Zoe outlived him. She married a second time, to a man whose name she barely knew before the wedding. She outlived him too. She married a third time, to a senator she had loved for decades. She outlived him as well. Across her 3 marriages between 1028 and 1050, the empire was run by the men of the civilian court at Constantinople. These men did not love the army. They did not love the families of Anatolia who provided its commanders. They had spent 2 generations watching the great military clans, the Phocas, the Skleros, the Komnenos, try to take the throne, and they had learned that the empire could be held without them. The reform was patient and structural. The themes of Anatolia, the administrative military districts that had been the recruiting pool of the army for 400 years, were turned over to civilian governors. The soldier tenants who had farmed their land in exchange for hereditary service were taxed in cash and excused from drill. The annual exercises lapsed. The fortresses were not repaired. The military aristocracy was exiled to monastery cells, executed on charges of treason, or married off into the court itself, where their grandsons would not learn the things their grandfathers had known. The treasury in those years was full. Constantine IX Monomachos, Zoe's 3rd husband, spent more money on the founding of monasteries and the patronage of philosophers than any emperor in 3 centuries. Michael Psellos, the courtier historian whose chronographia is the single best source for the period, and whose hostility to the military aristocracy is so plain that you can use it as a barometer, boasted in old age that he had been the empire's busiest legislator in a century. In the catalog of his own achievements, he says almost nothing about the army. Psellos does not say what was happening on the eastern frontier in those law-drafting years. He does say in one famous passage that the imperial gold piece was being debased at the mint by a fraction of its old weight under Constantine IX, a sign of pressure that he attributes to the emperor's generosity to deserving courtiers. The chroniclers from outside the court tell a different version. In the year 1045, the empire annexed the Armenian kingdom of Ani. Ani was the largest Christian city east of Constantinople, with, by the contemporary witness of the Armenian historian Aristakes of Lastivert, a population in the tens of thousands, and a wall ringed by towers along a triangle of high ground above the Akurian River. Its kings had ruled for 2 centuries. They had paid tribute to Constantinople for the last 50. When the last king died, Constantine IX's diplomats persuaded the regent to hand the kingdom to the empire in exchange for estates in Cappadocia. The annexation was peaceful, well-administered, and a disaster. The Armenian feudal cavalry that had been Ani's eastern defense was dissolved. The Armenian church, hostile to the Greek doctrines pressed on it, was alienated from the imperial center. The frontier east of the Euphrates was now held by Greek garrisons whose commanders had been appointed for political reliability, not for skill at fighting horse archers. There were horse archers at the gate. Out of Khorasan, far to the east, the country that is northeast Iran today, a Turkmen confederation under a chieftain named Tugril Beg had taken the Persian city of Nishapur in 1038 and the caliphate's capital of Baghdad in 1055. Tugril called himself Sultan. The caliph received him in the Great Mosque and gave him an investiture title that the Arab chroniclers preserve in several slightly different forms. But the substance was that the caliph, the spiritual head of the Sunni world, had accepted that the temporal power of Islam was now Turkish. The men Tugril led were called Seljuks, after a great-grandfather of his family who had taken the Turkmen out of the steppe and into Islam 4 generations earlier. They were nomadic cavalry. They drank fermented mare's milk and slept in felt tents. They had brought with them out of the steppe a way of fighting on horseback that the world of Iran and Mesopotamia had not seen since the original Arab conquests, and a tolerance for distance that the world of Anatolia had not seen since the Huns. Tugril Beg's nephew was named Alp Arslan. He was born around 1030. He was raised in the saddle. He spent the 1050s subduing his own uncles and cousins, who were not yet certain whether to call him their Khan or to kill him. When Tugril died in 1063 without a son of his own, Alp Arslan won a war of succession against his cousin Kutalmish. The manuscripts disagree on the manner of Kutalmish's death, whether he fell in pursuit or was found dead in the field afterwards, and inherited a confederation that ran from the Oxus to the Tigris. He was 33 years old when he took the throne. He was a head taller than most of his commanders, lean, an excellent shot with a recurved composite bow off a moving horse. His name meant hero lion in Turkish, and the mustaches that made him recognizable on the silver dirhams struck for him in Nishapur were said to be so long he had to knot them behind his head before drawing his bow. In the second summer of his reign, 1064, he marched on Ani. The wall of 40 towers, by Aristakes' description, held against him for the better part of a month. The garrison was Greek and small. The Armenian population, embittered by the dissolution of their kingdom and by the imposition of the Greek liturgy, did not rise to defend the new lords of their city. Matthew of Edessa, writing 2 generations later in a city the Seljuks would also take, describes Ani's fall in a chronicle whose Armenian original survives and whose 19th century French translation made it part of the standard European apparatus on the period. He says the city was emptied of its bells. He says the streets ran with blood from the cathedral to the river gate. He does not say what happened to the daughters of the Armenian noble houses, only that they were gone afterwards, and the chronicle's silence on that point is the loudest thing on the page. After Ani, the road into Anatolia lay open. Alp Arslan turned south for now to settle accounts with the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. The Anatolian raids were left to his Turkmen subordinates, who did not need a sultan to point them at a city. In Constantinople, the Emperor Constantine X Ducas. Zoe was dead. Theodora had ruled and died. The throne had gone briefly to a soldier emperor named Isaac Komnenos, who abdicated to a monastery, and the throne now rested with the civilian Ducas family. Refused to send a field army east. He answered the Anatolian raids with court letters, and with reductions in the standing army that his advisors said were the only way to balance the imperial books. The Anatolian families, the Komnenoi, the Botaniates, the Diogenes, watched their tenants ride east in the spring and not come back. When Constantine X died in 1067, leaving the empire to his teenage sons Michael and Andronikos, and to his widow Eudokia Macromboletissa, the Turkmen raiders took Caesarea, in the heart of Cappadocia, and stripped the great pilgrimage shrine of the city of every silver fitting it had. The capital of Cappadocia, the home province of the military aristocracy, was gone in a single summer. Eudokia Macromboletissa was a clever woman who had been forced by her husband on his deathbed to swear not to remarry. The Caesar John Ducas, her late husband's brother, had insisted on the oath. He intended to run the empire through his nephews and through her in that order. He had not counted on Caesarea. Within a year, Eudokia had her oath dissolved by the patriarch. The documents survive. The patriarch's reasoning has been argued over by canon lawyers since the 19th century. And she married, on the 1st of January in 1068, the man the Anatolian military families and the patriarch and the Senate had agreed must take the throne. His name was Romanos Diogenes. He was from a Cappadocian family. His father had served on the Bulgar frontier under Basil II and had died in a campaign whose particulars the chronicles do not record. He had been one of Constantine X's senior generals, tried for treason in 1067 on a charge of plotting to seize the throne. There were enough Cappadocian generals plotting that summer that the charge was not implausible, and acquitted because his judges admired his vigor and because Eudokia had pleaded for him. He was about 48 years old when he took the purple. He had been a soldier all his life. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had grown up on stories of Basil II's marches and of his own father's death in the field, that the empire's problem was that no one had taken its army east in 20 years. He took it east twice in the first 3 years of his reign. In 1068, he marched through Cilicia, retook a string of small towns the Turkmen had occupied, and went home for the winter. In 1069, he marched again, divided his army to cover more ground, was nearly cut off by a Turkmen counterstrike near Heraclea, and went home with the campaign technically won, but the frontier no more secure than before. He learned that the army he had inherited was not the army of his father's stories. The Anatolian themes had been hollowed for 2 generations, the German axemen and the Frankish and Norman knights, and the Pecheneg horse he was hiring with imperial silver were good soldiers individually, but they fought for pay and not for a homeland. And they took orders only as far as they understood them, which, on a steppe in summer, was not very far. He did not, as far as the chronicles record, draw the obvious conclusion. He decided instead that the third campaign, the one in 1071, would be larger, more deliberate, better provisioned, and aimed at the country east of Lake Van that had been Armenian and was now Turkmen, where Alp Arslan himself was rumored to be in person. He left Constantinople in March of 1071 with 40,000 men, more silver than 3 previous emperors had taken into the field combined, a personal physician, a notary to record his dispatches, and the political problem of the Ducas family riding 2 columns back. Andronikos Ducas, son of the Caesar John, the same John Ducas who had insisted on Eudokia's broken oath, was given the rear column. There was no other choice. The Caesar's faction was too powerful to be left in Constantinople with the army away. The Caesar's son was too prominent to be left in Constantinople under house arrest. He had to come along. He had to be given a command. He had to be kept where the emperor could see him. By the time the army reached Theodosiopolis in late June, the rear column was riding in a separate camp from the center, taking its meals at separate fires, and trading no information with the headquarters tent that it did not have to. By the 3rd week of August, the army was at Manzikert. The Norman captain Roussel de Bayeul and the Byzantine general Tarquiniotis had been detached south to take Kilat on the lake shore. The Pechenegs and Varangians and Cappadocians and Armenians and Germans and Franks and Latins were tired. The emperor had not slept 3 full nights in a row since Theodosiopolis. The scouts had been bringing in confused reports of Turkmen activity in the country east of the town, which the emperor and his Greek staff read as raiding bands. the kind they had already dispersed twice that summer. The reports were not of raiding bands. Alp Arslan, who had been preparing the summer campaign against the Fatimids in Egypt and was at Aleppo when the news of the Roman march east reached him, had turned around with the cavalry he could mobilize in a fortnight, perhaps 20,000 horse, perhaps 30, no source agrees, and was now camped 2 days' ride to the east of Manzikert, watching the Roman scouts come in and go out. On the night of the 25th of August, the Roman emperor sat in his command tent and gave the orders for the following morning. He intended to bring the Turkmen to a pitched battle. He did not yet know that his Frankish contingent under Roussel was 4 days' march south on the road to Kilat and would not return in time. He did not yet know that the Pechenegs in his center had been spoken to by Turkmen envoys in their own language, and might or might not stand at the next signal. He knew that he was on a plain his maps did not describe well, against an opponent whose movements his scouts could not track, with a rear column commanded by a man who would not meet his eye at the morning briefing. He gave the orders anyway. Friday morning broke clear over the citadel of Manzikert. The army formed up before the sun was high. The dust began to rise before the trumpets had finished sounding the deploy. 2 days' ride east of Manzikert, before the sun had cleared the ridge, the Seljuk Sultan walked alone out of his tent in a white cotton garment, of the kind a man is buried in. He had had the cloth cut from his own bed linen the previous evening. He had not eaten since the dawn of the day before. The Arabic and Persian sources that preserve this morning, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi at one remove, the Mosul historian Ibn al-Athir a century later, others more elaborately, disagree on the precise gestures but converge on the substance. He prayed 2 prostrations alone, facing southeast. He commanded that if he fell, his body was to be buried where he died, without a return to Khorasan. He had his hair shaved short and his weapons brought to him in order. He gave his household troops, drawn up in a ring around the tent, a single line, which Sibt ibn al-Jawzi preserves with the rhythm of remembered speech, that whoever took the Sultanate after him, if he did not survive the day, would have one task only, which was to drive these strangers off the land. Then he mounted, rode out at the head of an army the Greek scouts at Manzikert still did not believe was there in the numbers it was, and by the middle of the afternoon had the Eastern Roman line in his arrow storm. The battle was decided by 3 things, none of which the Romans understood until afterwards. The first was the detachment under Roussel and Tarquiniotes, 4 days' march south on the road to Kilat. They were not coming back. Roussel had received the order to return when the scouts reported Seljuk activity in force. He had not obeyed. The reasons for this are still argued. The Greek reading is that he was bought by Seljuk gold, or had decided to set up a private Norman lordship in Anatolia. The charitable Frankish reading is that the courier never reached him through country already cut by Turkmen scouts. In either case, he was absent. 4,000 of the army's best heavy cavalry were absent. The second was the Pecheneg cavalry in the imperial center. The Pechenegs had crossed the Danube 2 summers earlier and entered imperial service for pay. They were Turkic. Their language was close enough to the Turkmen across the field that they could speak with the men on the other side. Alp Arslan had sent envoys to them by some account. By another, they had spoken to them themselves. By the early afternoon, a portion of the Pecheneg cavalry, Italiates says about half, Bryennios rather less, had crossed the line. The men who remained had to watch their cousins ride away under the Sultan's banner. Whether the rest would also defect was the question that the emperor and his officers could not stop asking and could not answer. The third, and this is the one the historians return to most, was Andronikos Doukas in the rear. He commanded the second largest force on the field. He commanded the household cavalry of the dominant Constantinopolitan family. He commanded the political problem the emperor had been carrying for 3 years. And when, in the late afternoon, the Roman line, drawn out and tired, with its left wing dispersing, and the Pechenegs unreliable in the center, and the right under the Germans being slowly enveloped, was given the order to wheel about and retire to the night camp, Andronikos chose to read the order as the announcement of imperial collapse. There is a procedural question buried inside this. The order to wheel about, in a late Roman manual, is a controlled disengagement, not a retreat. It is meant to be executed by units in sequence, with the second line covering the first, the rear column covering the second line, and the baggage already moving toward camp. The signal, by trumpet and standard, is unambiguous in the manual. The signal, on a step at dusk, in dust thick enough to obscure color, with the imperial banner waving forward then back, is unambiguous only to a commander who has already decided how to read it. The continuation of Skylitzes, in the version recovered through the modern critical editions, says Andronikos rode up to the rear standards himself and announced that the emperor had fallen and that the army should disperse to camp. Bryennios the Younger, writing 50 years later in his Materials for History, reports the same. The Caesar John Ducas's son had reasons of family. He had reasons of policy. He had no reason of duty. The rear column wheeled and rode for the camp. The center, now unsupported, was overrun in the next hour. The Varangian guard formed a dismounted square around the emperor and was cut down in detail. Romanos IV Diogenes was wounded, by a sword cut to the right hand, the chronicles agree, though they do not agree on which of the next blows he took before he was pulled off his horse. He was recognized by his cuirass and by the purple beneath the dust. He was bound. He was brought alive to the Sultan's tent on a horse that was not his own. The exchange between the captured emperor and the victorious Sultan is preserved in several forms in the later Arabic tradition. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, ibn al-Athir, others, each working from sources now lost. Alp Arslan asks his prisoner what he would have done to him if their positions were reversed. Romanos answers without softening it that he would have killed him. Alp Arslan responds with the line that fixes the moment in two literatures, that he, the Sultan, would do something crueler. He would forgive. He raised Romanos from his knees. He had him seated and given clean water. He set him beside himself at the council. He set the terms of a truce, a tribute, a return of certain prisoners, a possible marriage alliance between the houses. He set the ransom at a small fraction of what the imperial treasury contained. He gave Romanos a horse from his own stable and a small Seljuk escort to see him out of the country. After 3 days, he sent him on. The kiss is the artifact this story turns on. 2 centuries of Greek and Arabic chronicles return to it. The Greek chroniclers return to it because they do not know what to do with it. A Christian emperor on his knees before a Muslim sultan in a tent on the field of his worst defeat, kissed and seated and treated as a peer. None of the